Chapter 1 of our book talks about what is delinquency and how is it different from adult crime. So, the delinquency is basically a violation of criminal laws, anything that is against the law, by someone who is considered a minor. And in most states, that means someone who is 18 or older. There are 5 states who set it at 17 or older, and one state, North Carolina, sets that age at 16. So, delinquency is committed by juveniles, whereas crime is committed by adults. Because we view juveniles differently than adults, we treat them differently, and this has led to what you might call the invention of juvenile delinquency. So this is still a relatively new concept. The juvenile justice system is about 120 years old, and early on there was no separate system. All criminal violations were treated the same, and juvenile offenders were treated the same as adult offenders. This meant that juveniles were subject to the death penalty. Some allowances were made for them, and a lot of times their sentences were not carried out. So what are the reasons we think of delinquents or juveniles as being different from adults? Now, the big one here would be immaturity. Um, we think of juveniles as people who are in need of guidance and help. We often think they don't know what they're doing is wrong, and if they know it's wrong, then perhaps they can't appreciate the harms their actions might cause. We may believe that they're not able to control themselves and that they're also easily led astray by others. But how do we decide when someone is no longer immature? There's no precise age at which we wake up and suddenly we're mature. We do know that the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is the part of your brain responsible for rational decision making, is not fully developed till around the age of 25. So we often view adults as responsible for their behavior and therefore deserving of punishment. We might also think of some older juvenile offenders and more serious juvenile offenders as being worthy of punishment as well, or that they should be treated as adults. So let's look at a couple scenarios that are mentioned in your text. In the first scenario, we have a 16-year-old girl from Florida who repeatedly hits her 7-year-old friend with a piece of wood while an older boy holds the girl's arms behind her back. The 7-year-old's nose was damaged and her dress was soaked with blood by the time she arrived home to her mother, and the parents called the police. They talked about trying her as an adult, which would have led to a penalty of 15 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. So stop for a minute and think about this. Do you think this 16-year-old girl, she certainly knows you're not supposed to hit your friend with a piece of wood, but do you think she understood the damage that she could have caused to her friends? Do you think she should be tried as an adult? In another scenario, we have a 6-year-old California boy who savagely beats a 1-month-old sleeping baby. He kicked, punched, and beat the baby with a stick, possibly causing permanent brain damage. And he was said to have been seeking revenge against the family of the baby. How would you address this? Is this different from the 6-year-old on the prior slide? So 21% of the public does support rehabilitation as the primary goal for adults, but 50% support it as the primary goal for juveniles. So even in the public, there is the thought that juveniles are more amenable to rehabilitation. So let's think about this. How will we define delinquency? We have 2 pieces here that count as delinquency. One is the most obvious one, which is criminal law definitions. So this is behavior that is illegal for anybody to commit, right? So these are things that society has deemed unacceptable and offers a sanction for that. The only distinction here with a juvenile is that they're not labeled a criminal, they're labeled delinquent. They can also be waived to adult court depending on the state you're in and the crime that was committed. Now there's another piece of delinquency that is behavior that is legal for adults to commit, and these are called status offenses, and they're only illegal because of your status, which is your age as a minor. A lot of times these kids will be considered a PINS, a CHINS, or a MINS. So the INS stands for in need of services. Massachusetts uses the CHINS designation, which stands for child in need of services. PINS is person, M is minor in need of services. So let's think about what are things that are illegal only because of your age. Well, juveniles are not allowed to run away from home or be truant, drink underage, violate curfew, in many states engage in sexual activity. And then the one that is most interesting is what we call incorrigibility, which is refusal to obey your parents. Now, this doesn't mean the type of refusal to obey your parents that most of you probably engaged in, but these are usually children who are unable to be controlled by their parents. The idea here with the juvenile system is to intervene when kids are giving us the idea or some warning signs that they might be headed down the wrong path. So these laws, these status offenses, tie directly to the idea that we think of juveniles as someone in need of guidance or direction. So we have special laws. So these status offenses are taken very seriously until about the late 60s, early 70s. And these kids were often formally processed, and they were sometimes subject to severe punishment. And they were often placed in the same types of facilities as juveniles who had committed actual crimes. So about half of kids in juvenile correctional facilities were there for status offenses. And this is especially true with regards to girls. And you'll see in the juvenile system that girls are treated quite differently than boys are. They're supervised more closely, especially with regard to their sexual behavior. So in the 60s and 70s, we start to see some criticism here, in particular of this idea of incorrigibility. One of the criticisms was that we're subjecting these kids to some pretty severe punishments, even though they haven't actually committed a crime. They're often institutionalized where they might be physically or sexually assaulted. And there was also evidence that poor, minority, and female juveniles were more likely to be punished for status offenses. So what do? They develop diversion programs. And the idea here is diversion should divert you from the formal court process. Now, diversion in practice looks a little bit different. A lot of diversion programs are things that offenders are actually sentenced to, but that's not true diversion. So true diversion would be dealing with the offender informally or referring them to special programs. That CHINS, PINS, and MINS designation also develops. The idea here being trying to reduce that stigma of the delinquent label. And in 74, the government passed a law that strongly encouraged states to stop placing status offenders in institutions. And this was largely effective, and most of these juveniles today are handled by social services. But delinquency and these status offenses are still illegal in almost all states, and several 100,000 status offenses are arrested each year, and tens of thousands are formally processed by the juvenile court. So we have a special court for juveniles, and it reflects that idea that we should guide and help, not punish. Now, the juvenile court is supposed to act in, quote, the best interest of the juvenile. The court is supposed to be a wise and merciful father handling his own child, not so much as to punish as to reform, not to degrade but to uplift, and not to crush but to develop. The focus here more is on the offender than the offense. And so what we do is we focus on the entire juvenile. What's going on with them? What's going on in their personal life, their family, school, with their friends. And the court is supposed to address these problems as opposed to simply respond to the offense. That means the system is less adversarial and more informal. That should say informal, not formal. Initially, because the goal here is to provide guidance to juveniles, there aren't very many due process rights, because if I'm helping you, you don't need to be protected by me. But since the 60s, that informality has changed, and juveniles now have almost all the same due process rights as adults. They do not have a right to a jury trial, although Massachusetts does give juveniles a jury trial, usually with a jury of 6. Juveniles do have the right to an attorney to confront and cross-examine witnesses, but juveniles often waive their rights, and that's often encouraged. And less than half of juveniles are represented by an attorney. So if you think about it, what are we often trying to encourage kids to do when we're raising them, right? We want them to tell the truth. We want them to take responsibility for their behavior. And so juveniles are often encouraged to tell the truth and take responsibility for their behavior, even though we would advise an adult in the same circumstances to seek an attorney and to stop answering questions. So we call the phases of the court something different in juvenile court. So juveniles are not arrested. They're taken into custody. They don't have a complaint against them. There's a petition in their interest. They're not charged with a crime. They're charged with a delinquent act. They don't have a trial. They have an adjudicatory hearing. They don't have a sentencing hearing. They have a dispositional hearing. And most importantly, they are not found guilty. They're adjudicated a delinquent or adjudicated a child in need of services. This means that juveniles with people with a juvenile record, as long as they haven't been tried in adult court, are not required to check off the box on any job application that asks if they've ever been convicted of a crime, because they have not been convicted of a crime. Some other differences here. The juvenile court is close to the public and the media, and they're often able to seal their records. They cannot be sentenced to death if they committed a crime before they were 18, and usually They cannot be confined past their 21st birthday. We also have special correctional programs for juveniles, and they're much more focused on rehabilitation. Juveniles have a constitutional right to rehabilitation. We also don't call their facilities and institutions prisons, so they're often called youth development centers. In Rhode Island, they're called training schools, and in Massachusetts, we have Department of Youth Services facilities, and they usually have like a specific name. Now, the exception to this rule is older, serious juveniles, and this happens because of the crime wave in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a lot of publicity and a lot of gang involvement here, and so many began to feel that this was not the work of kids who just need some rehabilitation and intervention, but that these were hardened criminals, and that the juvenile court wasn't equipped to deal with them. So it's become easier to try juveniles as adults. So how does delinquency come about? As I mentioned, we haven't always treated juveniles differently. In the late 1800s, the first thing that happens is we get mandatory school attendance. In 1899, we get that first juvenile court, and that's the Invention of Juvenile Delinquency. And by 1945, all states have juvenile courts. So what causes this change? Well, the concept of childhood changes, and that changes as a result of major social changes. So we're going to walk a little bit through this history just so you have an understanding of how this developed. So in order to understand the development of the juvenile system, you have to understand childhood. Up until the age of 5, 6, 7, children have the same status as any other property. You are considered the property of your father. Once you hit 7, though, things start to change. Some of the reasons you were treated like property is that there was a very low life expectancy. The infant mortality rate was more than 50%. This meant that parents often didn't develop a personal caring attitude towards their young, and this happened as a defense mechanism because so often these children would die. Families often lived day to day trying to provide for themselves, and each additional child was a burden. This led to practices like infanticide, abandonment, wet nurses, involuntary servitude, and apprenticeship. As I mentioned, children older than 7 were treated like adults. They lived and slept in rooms with adults, they drank alcohol, they engaged in sexual behavior, and they worked. So there were no distinct expectations for kids. There's no period of schooling or education that separates kids from adults. If you think about your early memories in life, you probably mark them by not how old you were, but what grade you were in, right? Oh, that's when I was in grammar school, or that's when I was in junior high. That distinction doesn't exist at this time. And so when kids misbehaved, they were often subject to severe punishment, much of which would be considered abusive today. When they broke the law, they were treated as adults. The father was responsible for controlling his children, and his punishment had no bounds. They were tried in the same courts with the same punishments. However, very young children are often exempt, and older children might receive a lighter punishment. In the mid-1500s and 1600s, we start seeing children as different from adults. And part of this is due to a decline in the death rate. Two-thirds prior to this had been dying before the age of 20. And as I mentioned, parents didn't form attachments. Because there's a decline in the death rate, people do start to form bonds. And we begin to see children as needing special care and protection. Education also starts to expand. And this is because of industry, trade, and printed materials. So formal education starts highlighting differences between immaturity and dependence of children, also widens the gap between what adults know and what children know. So as we begin to view them differently, we start to treat them differently. In 1555 in London, the Bridewell Institution is formed. And it's used to handle youthful beggars because the poor were seen as a threat to society. So these institutions developed to train the poor, and youth were considered more trainable than adults. In the 1800s and early 1900s, society becomes largely urban. So in 1790, only 5.1% of the population lived in urban areas, and only a few cities had more than 2,500 people. By 1920, over 50% of the population lives in urban areas. Urban areas are populated with poor and immigrants, and by 1920, half of the residents of major urban areas were immigrants or their children, and they're not always able to find work. As society starts to become urbanized and cities develop, we start to see problems like crime. And children are spending time on the streets, stealing and committing crimes to survive. The thought here was then that children were corrupted by their environment. If we could remove them from their environment and teach them skills, then we could reform them. And so in 1825, we see the first house of refuge in New York. The idea here is to remove children from those crime influences of workhouses and jails. Children were given an indeterminate sentence here to allow the institution to work with each person on an individual basis, providing education, skills training, and an apprenticeship. There's also a lot of religious training happening here, and the goal is to produce productive members of society. The impact, however, is questionable. Military behavior was the norm. Activities were far removed from the real world. Apprenticeship was basically slave labor. So these are basically new prisons. However, the juvenile court is generally considered a humanitarian development. The juvenile justice system allowed the powerful class of society to mold a disciplined and complacent workforce. So it basically becomes a means of preserving the existing class system. And the driving force behind it is the middle and upper class. So you have to question whether or not they're genuinely concerned with reforming kids or if they want the poor beggar children off the street from tainting their neighborhood. Most of these residential institutions in the early 1880s could pick and choose their clients, and so they wouldn't take African Americans, and then instead they had to be incarcerated. For women, proper training consisted of the expectation to stay home and raise a family. So as I mentioned, are they genuinely concerned with the welfare of these children, or is this an upper class disturbed by a large concentration of poor people, especially immigrants in the city?